Once you've found the right doctor and have told him or her about your pain, don't be afraid to take what they give you. Often, it will be an opioid medication. Some patients may be afraid of taking opioids because they're perceived as too strong or addictive. But that is far from actual fact. Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted. And any drowsiness that might occur when you start to take the medication will soon wear off in most patients.
The ad you just watched aired in 1998, paid for by Purdue Pharma, the now defunct pharmaceutical company once known for its sinister production of OxyContin. The commercial's production values and fixture on television screens may be of a modern era, but its message, well, its message can be traced back 150 years prior, when the United States of America was still in its infancy, but its drug trade was in full swing. Traveling doctors and medical minds alike were traversing the Western territories with the same message as Purdue Pharma, telling their patients, "Do not be afraid. This opioid will not hurt you." It's a tall tale as old as time, and in the Wild West, made for one of the most fascinating, if not tragic, epidemics of American society, of American history, and of American legacy. For Footprints of the Frontier, this is the story of morphine and whiskey, the doctors who prescribed it, and the crisis of frontier addiction that followed. Life on the far edge of the North American continent created conditions that practically begged for narcotic medicine. Families moving west were battered by disease and exhaustion. Most of the remedies available to them did little more than create placebo effects without real results. But morphine cut through that fog like nothing else on the frontier. It worked quickly, its effects were unmistakable, and it brought a level of calm that people simply could not find anywhere else in their daily lives. Storekeepers kept it behind their counters, traveling doctors carried it in their saddlebags, and desperate families tucked it into their wagons because they knew it was one of the few things that could ease the worst symptoms they encountered. In a place like the Old West, where illness killed far more people than gunfights ever did, a drug that dulled pain and pulled a person back from agony felt like a miracle. Let's gather the oxen, hitch a prairie schooner, and go back to the earliest days of manifest destiny on the westward trails, where sickness followed wagon trains like a shadow. These trails teemed with bad water and spoiled provisions, cold nights but scorching days, animals incubating their own disease. Frontier medicine was filled with horror stories that demonstrated how little many practitioners understood. For example, these purported doctors attempted amputations with tools meant for carpentry or shoemaking. They changed their minds midway through their cuts, unsure where to saw, and their patients died in the middle of surgery. Stories like this were not rare. Frontier life was fragile, and the limited medical knowledge turned deadly with untrained hands. Under those conditions, cholera, typhus, malaria, dysentery, screw-wormiasis, you name it, spread fast. A family could go from healthy to bedridden in a single day. With mortality so high, settlers came to believe that any medicine that hit hard must be real medicine. As such, one drug rose above the rest. Enter morphine, the mark of a true doctor, even when that physician delivering it barely understood what he was treating. The real danger lurked in that misunderstanding. Most frontier doctors didn't know why fevers rose, why wounds festered, how diseases could sweep through a camp like the 10th plague. Before germ theory, They blamed bad air or a patient's temperament. They didn't wash their hands or their tools, and they moved from sick beds to childbirth to flesh wounds to autopsies without pause. As a result, they spread deadly infections more efficiently than the illnesses spread themselves. It's no surprise that many Americans viewed doctors as hazards, not helpers. A home remedy or the advice of a seasoned midwife often seemed safer than the man with a medical bag. Still, a doctor was sometimes the only person with experience in setting bones or confronting other violent injuries. That thin margin of knowledge kept them in business, even though the line between doctor and quack was almost non-existent. With no licensing requirements in many states, anyone with confidence in a medical manual could claim expertise. Some had a few months of schooling or an apprenticeship, but plenty learned from mail-order diplomas or simply memorized passages from popular home medicine guides. They even dressed the part to fool prospective patients, and in many cases, fool themselves. Their treatments were as dramatic as they were misguided. People submitted to ice-cold immersions, wet sheet wrappings, harsh diets, cupping sessions, blistering pastes, and reckless bloodletting. It all stemmed from ancient theory instead of observation. When they weren't trying these methods, they leaned on patent medicines filled with opiates, alcohol, or toxic plants. Household names like Godfrey's Cordial or Dover's Powder were common in nearly every frontier town, and early commercial tonics, including the precursors to Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper, were sold as cures for everything from indigestion to melancholy. Mercury was the era's most dangerous mainstream drug. Doctors handed out consumables such as calomel and blue mass with complete confidence. They truly believed that heavy salivation was proof the patient's system was being cleansed. In reality, it was proof of mercury poisoning. Many patients endured these treatments alongside morphine, creating a cycle of bodily collapse that physicians interpreted as progress. You see, on the frontier, most medical thinking still leaned on an old worldview that tried to explain the human body through a balance of forces. Doctors believed the universe was composed of 4 elemental qualities, and the body mirrored those forces through 4 fluids they called humors. If a person was full of energy, they attributed it to an abundance of blood. If someone moved slowly or struggled with congestion, they blamed phlegm. Fevers, anger, and heat were tied to yellow bile, while despair or long sinking sadness was linked to black bile. To frontier doctors, illness was simply the body falling out of alignment. To push it back into balance, doctors built treatment plans that created dramatic bodily reactions. This in turn made them feel effective, even though they rarely helped. At the center of the practice, opiates sat under the spotlight. Morphine eased suffering in ways that contradicted humoral thinking, yet its results were undeniable, which made it the most trusted remedy many settlers ever encountered. In the Old West era, families often stuck with what they knew. Mothers and grandmothers passed down herbal practices and homegrown remedies driven by superstitions. These methods may not have defeated epidemics, but were far less destructive than the harsh interventions of professional physicians. People matched treatments to ailments through resemblance. Foods that reminded them of organs, plants that looked like skin conditions, roots shaped like snakes for snakebite. These methods were crude, but usually safer than mercury pills or aggressive bloodletting. Still, when a fever surged or an infection overwhelmed someone, these remedies offered little. That desperation turned combos of laudanum, morphine powders, opium tinctures, and whiskey into household staples. They eased pain, but more importantly, gave families some sense of control during long nights in the untamed wilderness. This desperation gave rise to the titular morphine and whiskey doctor. These practitioners ranged from trained physicians to confident wanderers who often called themselves doctors without formal education. Their toolbox was simple. Opiates quieted agony, slowed spasms, calmed fear, and muted the symptoms of almost any ailment. Alcohol cleaned the wounds better than nothing, steadied nerves, warmed freezing bodies, and created a loose sense of anesthesia during crude surgeries. Many of these doctors mixed both substances together to stretch their supply or make dosing simpler on the frontier. In the aftermath of gunshots, broken limbs, and third-degree burns, their methods often made the difference between a screaming soul and a manageable patient. Communities came to rely on them because their treatments produced results that could be felt immediately. And in the Old West, there was no time quite like the present. This increasingly impatient society was the world in which morphine gained its foothold. It didn't cure cholera or halt the spread of deadly viruses, but it did soften the suffering that accompanied nearly every frontier disease in the mid-19th century. By that point, doctors didn't need fancy imported laudanum to get the same effect. They built their own substitutes with whatever they had on hand. Morphine powder dissolved easily in strong whiskey, producing a homemade mixture that worked much like the opium-based tonic sold in cities back east. Because the strength could be adjusted by taste or necessity, these brews varied widely from dock to dock. Some kept theirs mild, just enough to settle a restless child or take the edge off a fever. Others mixed heavy doses that acted more like a knockout blow for patients of higher mass. The whiskey filled several roles at once. The alcohol dissolved morphine cleanly, kept the mixture from spoiling, depressed nerves, and doubled as an antiseptic when no other disinfectant existed. Most remote communities had little else to work with, and whiskey, with its long shelf life and ready availability, became the backbone of improvised narcotic medicine. Doctors on the frontier embraced injectable morphine with almost no restraint. Many had only a patchwork education and faced conditions they had no real tools to handle. When they reached for the syringe, they saw instant results. One account from New Orleans in the late 1870s described a doctor injecting half a gram of morphine into a man nearly beaten to death in a bar fight. The patient snapped awake as though rising from the grave, and the doctor called the effect a charm. That kind of reaction was intoxicating, not only to patients, but to the physicians themselves. With few other painkillers available and heavy pressure from patients who expected relief, doctors relied on morphine and whiskey because nothing else they carried worked as predictably. They used it for everything, from gunshot pain to menstrual cramps, from asthma attacks to the tremors of alcohol withdrawal. Even the great thinkers of the colonial era, Benjamin Franklin among them, used the opium alcohol mixture as casually as people now reach for aspirin. A powerful push toward national dependence came from the battlefields. Military surgeons administered staggering quantities of opium pills, powders, and syrups to manage the brutal injuries and dysentery that swept through the ranks. Millions of doses were issued to the Union Army. War also popularized the hypodermic syringe, a tool that delivered morphine's effects almost instantly. Doctors came to see it as a technological breakthrough and used it for ailments large and small. Veterans returned home with bodies mangled by warfare and nervous systems shaped by steady narcotic use. Many carried their dependency straight into civilian life. A common medical saying of the time summed up the tool's appeal. Morphine couldn't fix much, but it could ease almost anything. Morphine addiction was colloquially referred to as soldier's disease. By the late 19th century, medical journals were sounding alarms about widespread addiction, but the warnings did little to slow the habit. Doctors trusted their own judgment more than distant editorials. Patients continued demanding relief. Pharmacies stocked opiates in every form because there was no laws limiting their sale. Quote-unquote patent medicines held no restrictions. Manufacturers could include whatever ingredient they wanted and claim it created whatever benefits they felt would help the product sell. In 1888 Boston, Massachusetts, roughly 15% of all prescribed drugs involved opium, or more specifically, morphine. There were no prescription requirements, no oversight. People were hooked on those aforementioned patent medicines. Anyone could walk into a drugstore and walk out with enough narcotics to dull pain for a beached whale. In the West, the logic was even simpler. If laudanum had earned a reputation for soothing nearly any ailment, then mixing morphine and whiskey was seen as practical improvement, right? It was powerful, fast, familiar, and within reach of almost every settlement. That belief helped create a landscape where dependents grew like shadows in the evening sun, until the shadows shifted to twilight, and the dark of addiction started shaping not just the East, but the entire Western frontier. To understand addiction in frontier America, we must first understand addiction as it relates to the whiskey half of our Wild West doctor's favorite cocktail, alcohol. People in the East carried long-held views about drinking. Those views joined the immigrants westward and shaped how boomtowns judged anyone who struggled with alcohol. In the mid-1800s, addiction wasn't seen as a physical dependency or a medical condition. It was treated as a flaw in a person's character. Clergymen, newspaper editors, politicians, public speakers, all leaned on the same moral vocabulary, calling drunkenness an evil, a sin, a weakness, a sign of spiritual decay. When someone drank too much, society blamed them for every trouble that followed: lying, violent outbursts, gambling, theft, and in some cases, murder. A handful of early writers tried to frame excessive drinking as its own condition, using terms like, quote, dyspomania. And by the 1850s, a few European doctors had begun using the word alcoholism. The ideas behind those labels were shaky at best. Phrenologists claimed alcohol simply overstimulated the animal parts of the brain, all while dulling a person's judgment. Even with these first attempts at a medical explanation, heavy drinking was still viewed primarily as a conscious act by a man's own free will. Social and economic classes played major roles in how problem drinking was interpreted. Working men drank in saloons, dance halls, and noisy beer houses, places where any misstep became public immediately. Their behavior drew scrutiny from local authorities and, worse yet, the prying eyes of austere reformers who treated poor drinkers as a public nuisance. Meanwhile, wealthier men drank just as hard behind closed doors, in gentlemen's clubs, private parlors, even the formal dinner parties, but avoided the same condemnation. Their drinking was framed as a social feature rather than a failing. As for the austere reformers, the reformers, especially those in the temperance movement, often focused their efforts on the blue-collar cliques. Some did so with a patronizing gall, believing they were helping people climb upward. Others were nothing more than anxious, terrified of the disorder that large drinking crowds produced. Ironically, many temperance groups were formed by working-class people themselves, trying to build healthier habits and gain respect. Still, no matter the groveling, the punishments for heavy drinking remained uneven. An alcoholic cattle baron might be forgiven or quietly helped by their family, while a marble quarryman risked arrest, job loss, and a lifetime of public shame. As the 19th century progressed, another branch of the temperance movement took hold: teetotalism. Instead of limiting only hard liquor, teetotalers demanded total abstinence from every alcoholic drink. Beer and wine be damned. Because drinking was such a common part of daily life, these groups built their own social networks where staying sober was the norm. They opened alcohol-free clubs, reading rooms, gathering halls, and hotels. Fancy a bowling alley or billiard parlor? The teetotalers had one. Members pledged publicly to avoid alcohol, sometimes signing their names at large community meetings. These pledges created a sense of solidarity, but also a sense of pressure, as breaking one meant shaming yourself before neighbors and peers. By the time frontier towns grew into bustling settlements, many residents already had relatives or friends tied to temperance groups. And for good reason. Alcohol was everywhere, as was its favorite pairing and resulting malady, morphine addiction. Opium and morphine were not fringe substances. Like alcohol, they were everywhere, sold in drugstores, carried by traveling doctors, mixed into patent medicines, and most fascinating of all, kept in the family cupboards. Much of this widespread use traced back to the Civil War, which became the first moment in American history when enormous numbers of people were exposed to potent narcotics in a systematic way. Military surgeons leaned heavily on morphine for battlefield pain, for dysentery, for surgical shock, for any injury too severe, for whiskey alone. Soldiers quickly learned how comforting morphine felt, and many returned home with a familiarity that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Remember, in 1865, no one recognized dependency as a medical condition. If a veteran shook, sweat, or collapsed into despair without morphine, doctors often blamed weak nerves or simple melancholy. They didn't understand withdrawal, and they certainly didn't understand trauma, which has since become one of the clearest through lines in accounts of post-war addiction. To the soldiers, morphine seemed like a carnival magic trick. It calmed the mind and quelled the body without fail. As the decades wore on, the country's drug supply changed dramatically. Old apothecaries evolved into increasingly professionalized pharmacies. Chemists refined their processes, creating powders of consistent strength, in addition to injectable doses via sturdy syringes that delivered morphine more directly into the bloodstream. Better chemistry meant greater potency, and greater potency meant many users found themselves dependent before they even recognized what was happening. This shift set the stage for a second stronger, if not quieter, epidemic: the rise of widespread morphine use among middle and upper class women. By the late 19th century, women made up the largest group of steady opiate consumers. Doctors prescribed morphine for menstrual problems, painful childbirth recoveries, insomnia, nerves, and the broad category of, quote, female complaints that covered everything from grief to anemia. Patent medicines targeted them relentlessly. Bottles of morphine and whiskey, laudanum lozenges, soothing syrups, and the snake oil snakeman's favorite, restorative tonics, were sold under the guise of refinement and propriety. Because many women were discouraged from drinking publicly or entering saloons at all, opium-based products became a private alternative that fit neatly within the bounds of respectability. A man could be seen drunk in a bar without losing his social standing. A woman could not. But she could swallow a tincture labeled as a household remedy, and no one would question it. Medical prowess during this period, let alone the vast solitude of the region, gave people little protection. Addiction science did not exist yet. Physicians were treating dependency as a bad habit or a temporary weakness rather than a physiological condition. Their solutions often deepened the problem. They prescribed morphine to alcoholics, cocaine to people hooked on morphine, and later, heroin as a supposed escape from morphine withdrawal. A cycle stuck in the western web of wilderness, leaving wandering folk left to the whims of desultory doctors' superficial substances. Drug companies then marketed these substances as modern, clean-cut cures. Cocaine drew early praise because its stimulant effect sharply contrasted with the sedation of opium. Heroin was promoted as non-addictive. The medical field had no working model for tolerance or long-term dependence, so many practitioners relied on their instincts or on whatever claims their manufacturers printed on the bottle. As the 19th century wound down and the West was a little less wild, the country's relationship with drugs began to shift once again. Reform groups that had started out fighting alcohol gradually broadened their scope, insisting that narcotics deserved the same scrutiny. Many thought that they were closing the lid on one problem, only to discover that opium, morphine, laudanum, and the like were quietly taking alcohol's place in homes where liquor had been pushed out. The public might have heard fiery speeches about moral decline, but in practice, people could still walk into a pharmacy and buy a bottle of heroin cough syrup or a packet of morphine powders without raising suspicion. Families kept opium teas in their kitchens, and parents rubbed cocaine drops onto their children's gums for toothaches. Drug use was woven into daily life, a norm amongst norms. Shifting from one intoxicant to another felt unremarkable. Once local temperance victories began limiting access to alcohol, small black markets emerged. Some towns were dry, others were not. The result was a tight lattice of county lines that encouraged people to make short trips to buy whatever they couldn't get at home. Pharmacists willing to bend the rules filled the gap, selling narcotics out the back door or watering them down to stretch supply. These improvised distribution networks became the template for black markets and smuggling on the national scale, all well before federal drug law existed. Lawmakers made their first real attempt to rein in morphine use at the state level during the late 1800s, but their reasons had little to do with public health. Early anti-opium legislation grew out of racial prejudice against Chinese immigrants. Drinking opium or injecting morphine, methods favored by white Americans, remained largely untouched, while smoking in opium dens was demonized. California outlawed opium dens in 1881, but allowed private use to continue. Nevada banned smoking and restricted sales in 1877. Oregon enacted broad narcotic regulations in 1877, covering morphine and several forms of opium. Of course, none of these laws touched the potent pharmaceutical-grade drugs that caused the most dependence. They aimed at specific cultural practices rather than the substances themselves. A national wake-up call arrived in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act. It didn't criminalize narcotics, but it did something the country had never seen. It forced manufacturers to admit what they were selling. Any medicine containing opium, morphine, or several other secret sauces had to disclose those ingredients. For many Americans, this was the first time they realized that the soothing syrup on their shelf contained an addictive narcotic. Coca-Cola, under pressure, removed the narcotic component from its formula. Patent medicine companies stalled and protested, but eventually they too were pulled into the new era of transparency. Much like the West, the drugs were tamed after the turn of the century. Public awareness also began to rise. Mothers were cautioned about giving opiate-laced syrups to infants. Doctors, still operating without a modern understanding of addiction, started using the phrase drug habitué to describe regular morphine users. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. The momentum that had been building since the late 1800s finally collided with federal law in 1914, when Congress passed the Harrison Narcotic Act. Lawmakers advertised more like a bookkeeping measure, meant to catalog narcotics and tax their sale, all in the name of keeping better records. Of course, they did not present it as a ban on morphine or opium. To the medical profession, it looked like yet another regulatory formality in an era already swimming in new paperwork. But tucked inside the law was a dainty detail that ultimately reshaped the country's entire approach to addiction. Narcotics could only be dispensed in the course of professional practice. Federal agents interpreted that line as a prohibition on maintaining dependent patients on their usual doses. Overnight, anyone known to be reliant on opiates was no longer considered a patient at all. Federal prosecutors then launched an aggressive campaign against physicians they believed were catering to addicts. Many were fined or imprisoned. Others surrendered their licenses to avoid prosecution. The message spread quickly. Prescribing narcotics to anyone with a history of dependence could end a career and result in prison time. The people most affected were the ones who had become reliant under medical supervision. They suddenly found every legal source closed. Pharmacists turned them away. Doctors refused even to discuss narcotics out of fear of violating the law. A dependency that had once been managed in the open shifted abruptly into the shadows. The excruciating reality of withdrawal was waiting around the corner. From that point, black markets expanded with incredible speed. Users who had once relied on doctors turned to street dealers. Many were arrested simply for possessing the drug that kept them functional. By 1923, 3/4 of all women in federal prisons were serving sentences tied to the Harrison Act. Regulatory law had, in practice, become criminal law. Even as this crackdown unfolded, medical thinking about addiction evolved in stride. Physicians documented withdrawal symptoms, recorded patterns of tolerance, beginning to understand that dependence involved physical changes, not just poor choices. The rise of pharmacology brought a new scientific vocabulary too. Yet, these advances did nothing to soften the law. This tension continued as the late 19th century follies faded into the early 20th's progressive streak, and the culture of self-dosing that had dominated earlier generations faded with it. States reinstated medical licensing. Homemade medicines gave way to standardized, professionally manufactured pharmaceuticals. Federal oversight became a fixed part of American life. But none of these developments reversed the criminal framework created by the Harrison Act. Addicted individuals remained outside mainstream medicine, forced into an underground world that sank deeper and darker with each year. By the early 1900s, the United States had already accumulated a massive population of opiate-dependent citizens. Estimates reached well above 1 million. Black market supply often surpassed what remained in legal demand. Coastal cities evolved into major smuggling ports, feeding an expanding national network of dealers and middlemen. A new drug dominated this landscape because prohibition finally wiped out legal morphine access. Heroin became the preferred commodity because its compact size made it ideal for smuggling, and the drug's strength meant that small quantities satisfied demand. By 1924, the federal government banned its importation entirely, but the prohibition only cemented its place in underground commerce. Its potency, portability, and profitability locked it in for the long term. As the era of boomtowns and wagon trains faded, the country stepped into a new age of drug use, drug enforcement, and drug misunderstanding. The groundwork for modern narcotic policy had been laid, but the roots stretched back to the frontier world of morphine powders, traveling doctors, and whiskey-based medicine. Remember, the concoction brought sleep to the delirious and pacified the fearful, dulling the agony of conditions no doctor could truly treat. Its ability to quiet pain gave people a measure of mercy in a place where mercy was scarce. And that alone made narcotics and alcohol, or more specifically, whiskey and morphine, the most valued medicine the Wild West had ever known.